Hey everyone, I'm going to get everyone started doing some programming challenges in Node.js where we're using Node to run JavaScript files and doing some asynchronous programming. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new repository. If you're following along for the class, please make sure that you've watched the lecture for this week on Node.js and on asynchronous JavaScript programming. So let's go ahead and get started. Make sure if you're following along with the lab, I believe it's called Lab 0101. And so you get to follow along and name it, as the lab suggests. Let's go ahead and mark this as a public repository, add a README. The get ignore is Node. So we're not putting certain files and folders onto github.com that do not need to be copied up, and the license is MIT. And so I'll go ahead and create this repository. Now once you have a repository created, it's basically an empty folder. We need to clone it. So the next step is to clone it. We're going to do that by clicking the code button and copying this URL to the clipboard. And at this point you can use GitHub Desktop, which you should have downloaded. And I'm going to paste, when I open up GitHub Desktop, you're going to click File, Clone Repository, and then you're going to click on this URL tab and paste in that URL that you just copied. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this, you put it wherever you want on your computer, but I'm going to put it on my desktop. I have a folder called AWD Repos, and then I've got my name here, so I'm going to select that folder. And so it'll put it in my folder and then lab 0101. I'm going to click clone. So I now have this folder on my local computer that I can go into here. And you can see I have this lab 0101 folder. And if I right click this, I can open this up with code. If you don't have that option, it is an option when you install VS Code to be available on a right click. But if you right click and it's not there, let's just open up VS Code and go about it a different way. So I'm going to close this folder, and so this is kind of VS Code when it first boots up, and I'm going to click on open folder, and I'm going to navigate to my lab 01 folder. And so here we go. Now the first challenge says make a file, miles per gallon .js. And so we're going to write our JavaScript in this file here, and in the lecture, Learn Node.js is here in my hotbar. I talk about what kind of imports do we need to do in our JavaScript files to get like a standard in. And so let me find that article real quick. It should be somewhere in here. Let me find it. Okay, so I've landed here on the Node documentation for readline. And so when you kind of are on this page learning how to bring in a readline, you get these toggles between common JS and ES modules. So ES modules are the newer syntax, and so we're going to use the ES modules. Now, with this ES modules, that means I can actually rename this file from JS to MJS. And then we can start bringing in these imports. As you can see here, import star is readline, import, and then this. So these three lines will allow us to get a start in creating this variable called R1 that can await a response from the keyboard. So as I bring those three lines here, that's going to be how we get started. So again, this is just using the Node documentation on read line, here is the other syntax, but I would replace this with a more updated syntax. So I will literally, paste this newer syntax, and this piece of code, well, asks the user for their thoughts around Node.js, and then responds with their input. So basically gets a piece of input called answer and then puts it back in a console log. And so if I were to just straight take that entire piece of code that is now in that documentation, right, save that, and then we can open up a terminal and run this. So let's open up a new terminal. And let's type in node mpg.mjs. It's great. Thank you for your valuable feedback. It's great. So all we did was accept a piece of input from the end user and then spit that back. Now, again, we're using this newer syntax, these ES modules, if you will, so that we can use these import statements. And we're doing some asynchronous programming, waiting for the user to give back this response. And so we have the keyword await that is freeing up the processing power of our machine to go do other things until the user responds and then puts that in a variable. Okay, so the first programming challenge is miles per gallon. So it's a pretty simple problem. We asked the user for how many miles did they drive and how many gallons did they consume. So we're going to solve a miles per gallon is miles driven divided by gallons used. So let's go ahead and declare a const, because we're not going to have to change this. Miles driven equals await. And now there is a question. There's also a question int, but the question should return obviously the difference between returning an int versus a string, but we're going to return a string here. And how many gallons of gas did you use? So then we can just do something real simple before we do any error checking, and we'll say your car gets how many miles per gallon. So again, I mentioned this earlier, but I do have GitHub Copilot kind of speeding things along here. Obviously, that's a tool that we haven't really introduced in this class or ranking up until your second year. Now that many of you are in second year, I would encourage you to get familiar with this tool, which is Copilot, and help you write code a little faster. And again, we're gonna, check that out. Now, as a Rankin student, I mentioned this. If you check out the GitHub Developer Pack, GitHub Student Developer Pack, you want to sign up for this, register for it. You have to provide, your student ID. But part of this developer pack is Copilot. So you could then bring in Copilot as an extension. So if I go to my extensions, I have GitHub Copilot enabled as an extension, and then you don't have to pay for it because you use that developer pack, and you have to link it to your GitHub developer pack. So point is, that's why I'm getting this kind of code assist. And now if I run this again and I say 102, we get 50 miles per gallon, so the math is coming out fine. 103, we get 33.3 is repeating. And so I believe the lab says go ahead and do some error handling, which is to make sure that your miles driven is both a number and a positive number. So we could do something like if well, I'll start off with isNan. Is miles driven if it's not a number, or miles driven is less than 0. So, if it's not a number or if it's less than 0, then I'm going to provide some console.log. Please enter a valid number for miles driven. Else if gallons used, kind of the same concept. Else we should have valid data, in which case we'll put both the calculation and the output inside of that else block. So now if I run and I say A10 says please enter a valid number for miles driven. And if I were to say a -1, 10, same deal. If I give it a valid number there and a bad, please enter a valid number for gallons used. But if I give it some good numbers, there you go. We get the calculation. Now we could do miles per gallon to fixed to say, hey, let's just round it to 2 decimal places. And now we should get 33.33 miles per gallon. So this is a pretty simple problem to solve. The problems do get slightly more complicated. And the rest of the lab, this is the first exercise of 4. So do not hesitate if you're doing the lab and you're stuck to reach out and ask for help. But I wanted to get you started, to get my students started writing Node, writing JavaScript, and executing that with the with the terminal using this Node command line tool. Now, of course, you have to have Node installed, and this was part of the setting up your environment, but you need to have this downloaded and installed, this 2010 LTS, for this to work. And additionally, it needs to be a recognized command at the terminal. So I believe now if I go into my CMD and I type in path, that in all of these various locations, one of these is going to be my path to where you can find the node command. But if you type in the word node and the file name mpg.mjs, it should work. But if it says something like an error that node is an unrecognized command, that's because you need to update your path environment variable. But I don't think that that's going to be a problem. I think when you run the installer, it automatically updates the path. But if all of that last piece doesn't make any sense, you could always reach out to me and I can help you update this thing called the path. When you're done, like that's the first one, to turn this into me, we're going to go back into GitHub Desktop, and you're going to see that there's a changed file, and I'm going to say completed exercise 1. You're going to do both a commit and a push. And I need to re-authenticate with my credentials. And so I need to probably sign out and sign back in. And that should fix that. There we go. So sign out, sign back in. Just been a while since I've done that. and I just did a push. Now I can go back to github.com, refresh my repository, and it says completed exercise number 1. So that's how you're going to turn it in. Last but not least, of course, as the lab says, you're going to need to share this with me. So if you go to your Lab 0101 settings, add me as a collaborator. So you're going to add people, type in Evan Gudmested, and that will send me an email so that I can get access to your lab. Okay, but that's how you problem solve using some JavaScript and Node and some asynchronous programming. That should get you started with your lab. Reach out if and when you have questions. Thanks.